All righty. Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of One Plus One, your place for inconvenient truth telling and myth busting. And on the program, in another one of our All Things Canada edition, we'll be looking at the history of one of Canada's longest serving political parties, a party that has dominated much of Canadian history and world history. It's one of the most successful political parties in history and has even been called Canada's natural governing party, and that is the Liberal Party. Where it lies on the political spectrum, we'll examine. It's a party that's often been talked about on One Plus One, but we've never done a program looking at the history of the Liberal Party from a critical leftist perspective, and that's what we'll do. And in light of the recent resignation of Justin Trudeau and what will be a pretty competitive Liberal Party leadership race, which might end in a general election, it might end in the huge defeat in a Conservative comeback in Canada, led by Pierre Poilievre. This is a very timely episode. So, my guest for the hour or so is our returning champion, Tyler Shipley. Tyler is a historian, professor of society, culture, and commerce in the Department of Liberal Studies at Humber College Institute of Technology and Advanced Learning. He holds a PhD in political science from York University. Tyler is also the author of two books, Ottawa and Empire, Canada and the Military Coup in Honduras, and Canada and the World, Settler Capitalism and the Colonial Imagination. And he's had articles published in Canadian Dimension, Rabble.ca, the Canada Files, Socialist Project.ca, where he's often invited to speak on certain topics, and he's featured in the brilliant six-part docuseries on Canada's history of imperialism, Shoot to the Powerless. So, first off, Tyler, thanks for coming on the program. Thanks for coming back on the program, and a happy new year.
Thanks, Youri. Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here. Always good to talk to you.
Likewise, it's a real honor to have you. And just before we continue, sadly, I am a history buff, and often guests are pretty generous with their times. But due to strict times, but due to strict times, and to try to not make this the Youri Rogan experience, we won't cover all aspects of the Liberal Party. So its history with respect to feminism and gender equality, queer history, black history, its relations to indigenous people, we might talk about a little bits in terms of settler colonialism, settler capitalism, and Canada's imperial history. We won't get too much into that because we simply don't have enough time. But if anyone is interested in coming on the program to talk about the Liberal Party's unique histories with all of those marginalized groups, hey, I'm game to talk about that. But we will be talking about domestic affairs, and Tyler has warned me that we will be talking a bit about devote some time to imperialism. So, anyways,
That's what I do.
we will be mostly talking about the Liberal Party's relation to the largely working class, precarious middle class, white working class, and its legacy with that. So, Tyler, first question. So the first question I wanted to. Oh yes, and another warning to people: I am sick with bronchitis, so if I'm not at my A game, that's my warning. So, Tyler, so the first question I want to ask you before we look at the leaders of the Liberal Party, many who have been Prime Minister of Canada, is how would you describe the political ideology of the Liberal Party of Canada? The most accurate I found on Wikipedia is that they are a big tent party, and previous guest Dimitri Lascaris, who's been on the program many times, when he was on the Real News Network, he once described the Liberal Party, and I quote, many people would describe the Liberal Party as a centrist party, others center left. I prefer to call them and describe them as a center right party. So, so with that said, how do you explain the political philosophy of the Liberal Party of Canada?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to pin down. It's a good question because I think a lot of the electoral success of the Liberal Party over the past century and a half has been seeming like everything and nothing all the time. Um, I mean, this many biographers of William Lyon Mackenzie King, who I'm pretty sure was the longest serving Liberal Prime Minister, maybe all the Prime Ministers, his signature move was not seeming to be committed to anything and being kind of committed to everything. And I think in many ways that is emblematic of what the Liberal Party has been over certainly in the modern era in the 20th century. But what when I was thinking about this conversation and what did I have to say about it, um, one of the things I wanted to do was maybe contextualize the liberal and conservative split in Canada and in general. And the way I would explain it, if I was teaching, say, an introductory, political science course, I
Hmm.
would I would take the split between liberalism and conservatism as reflective of a very early stage in capitalism, where conservatism was about, believe it or not, resisting capitalism, resisting the free market in defense of the monarchy or the old aristocracy, the old forms of rule, the church, whatever. Conservatism, in its kind of contemporary form, its origins are in a reaction against the rise of capitalism and the chaos and dislocation that capitalism created for the old authorities. To be clear, okay, this isn't like defending the working class, the
Hmm.
peasants,
Okay.
and then the new working class. This is about defending the monarchy, the church, the old institutions of power. So Edmund Burke is the political philosopher most associated with the emergence of conservatism, and that's his fear. His fear is what's going to happen to, the traditions, the church, the community, the nobility, the aristocracy, and so on. That's the natural state of affairs. There's a natural king and a god and a, priest and a earl and a duke, and they're supposed to be up here, and everyone else is supposed to be down here. But capitalism is shaking this up. So that's kind of like the origin of conservatism. Now, by contrast, liberalism is the ideology of capitalism. Liberalism is the ideology that rises with the rise of capitalism and is specifically about a political philosophy that operates around and within to sustain capitalism, right? So if you think about liberal values, they will often include things like representative democratic rights. Okay, yeah, elections, right? But elections that take the question of capitalism off the table. No political party in the liberal mindset, no political party is going to threaten the basic free market principles that would govern society. But within that, liberalism wants us to all express ourselves, feel like we can say what we want. We have freedom of religion, we have freedom of speech, we have all these individual freedoms, which can be important. Like I don't want to dismiss them, but they always stop short of any questioning of the capitalist world order at large. So I set all of this up
Yeah. Yeah.
in order to kind of set the stage for those things in Canada. And if you look at, okay, well, where does the Liberal Party come from in Canada? The Liberal Party was the reformers of the 1830s. The revolution, well, I won't call them that, but the rebellions that take place in the 1830s in what is now Ontario and Quebec, that were about fighting for basic democratic rights. They called it responsible government, but it was a fight for, the British authorities should pay more attention to what we here in the colonies want. And the we is not working people, right? The we is not black people who had been brought over as slaves. The we is not indigenous people whose land had been stolen. The we is white settlers, typically landowners, who want to have more control over their emerging capitalist state. It wasn't a state yet, but. And then the conservatives are those who are closer to Britain, who want to maintain their ties to the British Crown, who want to maintain their patronage, their appointments that they get from being close to the British Crown, etc. So, I know that's a bit long-winded for an introduction, but it is to say
Very
right from the
important though.
start, yeah, I think so. Right from the start, you've got the conservative and liberal factions are both essentially within the realm of capitalism, they simply are in different relationships to it, right? Liberals are the ones who are pushing for and establishing the the sort of intellectual architecture of capitalism. Conservatives are the one who are trying to hang on to the old things, the old elements, while, of course, to a certain extent, adapting themselves to capitalism, which, and this will be the last point I make, before I let you jump in and ask any follow-ups, John A. Macdonald, of course, is a conservative. And so this may seem like a contradiction. Here I am saying the conservatives wanted to be close to the colonial heartland, but John A. Macdonald led Confederation, and that is true. Conservatism has always been in a bit of a contradiction in the modern era, because really conservatism was about trying to stop any disruption of the old authority. But there's a point at which capitalism is a fait accompli. It's not going to change. It's not going away. And so conservatives adapt to that, and they become a rival faction within liberalism. And that this is kind of, I guess, my final point that I want to make in setting us up here. I don't think really meaningfully there is an ideological divide between the Liberal Party of Canada and the Conservative Party. They are both liberal parties. They are both parties of capitalism who have different specific factions of capital that they represent, different specific interests at different times, different personalities, certainly a different orientation to the electorate over time. The Liberals play nice, the Conservatives, do not. They play racist, they play sexist, all these things that they do, but they are both parties of capitalism fundamentally. So I don't know if that's helpful, but that, when you said you wanted to have a discussion about the Liberal Party, I thought, this is at least something we can establish as a groundwork for understanding everything that happens after.
Exactly. And what can you tell us then about the first prime minister that the Liberal Party ever produced, which is Alexander Mackenzie, who I believe he was actually the second prime minister Canadians largely voted for, but the first ever for the Liberal Party. What can you say about his legacy, the good and the bad and the ugly? And the reason why I emphasize that we should talk about whatever good, if there's any good that some of these Liberal prime ministers did, is because the Liberal Party because the Liberal Party, for our American brothers and sisters in the non-binary, the Liberal Party basically, like, what people see the Democrats in the U.S. As a liberal party, an economically liberal party, at times socially liberal party, and but also a bit of a big tent party, if you will, who are going to make capitalism a little bit nicer for people. That's basically the Liberal Party of Canada in a nutshell. And the modern day Liberal Party of Canada, I would say, if you were to put them in the American context, Joe Biden, Bill Clinton, Obama would be perfect for that, and no room for a Bernie Sanders. He would be in the NDP, but he actually would be a much more, to a degree, he would be a much more radical NDPer. But that's a whole other story for another day. So
The NDP would be pushing him out just like they did to several people over the last few years who expressed even mild consideration of Palestine.
Yeah. So what do you want to say about Alexander Mackenzie King before we talk about the more popular guy who came after him?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, Youri, I don't have much to say about Alexander Mackenzie. I don't really, I don't think there's all that much of significance, and I'm sure Canadian historians of that era would jump in and be like, wait a minute, you're forgetting these concessions that he gained from the British Crown or whatever. But for me, the stuff that I was saying at the start about understanding the Liberals and Conservatives as two factions of the parties of capitalism and colonialism, that's what matters about that early era. I mean, Confederation happens because people in both parties come together. Yes, spurred on by the conservative John A. Macdonald, but with support from Liberals, they come together in an effort to make a colonial claim to the Canadian prairies, what becomes the Canadian prairie provinces. That's the specific purpose of Confederation. And inherent in that specific purpose of colonizing that land, making sure that it's, those settlers who claim it rather than the US settlers that claim it, expressed within that is the project of genocide that accelerates in the West during that period, because there is this rapid, urgent need to colonize that place with European settlers. And the only way to do that, of course, is to remove the people that lived there by force, by violence, by hunger, by starvation, by kidnapping to residential schools, by the creation of the reserve system, etc. All of which is done with the consent of both political parties. So to me, it's like, well, the most important thing that's happening in Canada in this period is colonialism. And there is no distinction between the two parties on this question. And frankly, there never has been. And I don't think there ever will be. If you go, as we move through the history of the 20th century, as we look at people like William Lyon Mackenzie King, who was, a significant Canadian Prime Minister.
Actually, before we talk about him, is there anything you can tell us about Wilfrid Laurier? There's even institutes and overpriced universities named after him. He was the seventh Prime Minister of Canada. What was his legacy with the working class, middle class, and what you call settler capitalism in your book? What was the good and the bad and ugly, if any?
I mean, I think if there's anything for our purposes that's like worth noting about Wilfrid Laurier, it's the role that he played and the traditional role that the Liberal Party has played in easing the tensions between the two groups of colonial settlers of Canada, right? Laurier obviously is, his most significant contribution in many respects is to bridge the gap between the ruling class in Quebec and the ruling class in English Canada.
It's very important you mentioned that because Quebec was basically was a settler colonial colony within a colony when Canada was founded as the Confederate country that it was, and many Quebecers faced marginalization from the crown, from the English crown. But funny enough, Quebecers found a place in this big tent we call the Liberal Party, correct?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think, it's in the context of the construction of the racial hierarchies in Canada. If we want to talk about, this period, late 1800s, early 1900s, the emergence of, I think it's Ian Mackay and Jamie Swift that called it a liberal racial order, a kind of a structuring of Canadian society that used race to kind of cement the various platforms within the class society that was being created. It would be, the Anglo world was at the top, of course, and then in Quebec, the French, and then everything else, all of the other groups of immigrants flow beneath that, right? And of course, at the very bottom, you have Black people and Indigenous people who have the least amount, or who are the most marginalized in very different ways, but the most marginalized in Canadian society. So, when Wilfrid Laurier is sort of heralded as in older texts, it will often be read as like, he was the one that brought the two races together. And it'll, there's this discussion of like, the bringing together of the two races that formed Canada.
You mean you mean Anglophones and Francophones?
That is exactly what they meant when they said the two races.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah. It's significant that the Liberal Party did that insofar as part of the reason the Liberal Party emerged as the de facto ruling party in Canada, to your point at the opening. Part of that is that they found a way to bridge the ruling classes of Quebec and the rest of Canada. And they have consistently been able to do that. There haven't been very many moments. There have been a few, but there haven't been very many moments along the way where the Liberal Party lost Quebec. Obviously, it got a little bit more complicated with the creation of the Bloc Québécois party. But even then, a lot of what became the sort of partisans of the Bloc Québécois had migrated away from the Conservative Party. The Bloc is a very right-wing political party, as most nationalist parties tend to be. So yeah, Laurier's legacy, if there's anything significant, in my perspective, is just that he was able to make the Liberal Party relevant again after, it had been kind of marginalized. To backtrack the story to explain that a little bit, why is it then, if the Liberal Party is the party of Canada, how is it possible that it was, Canada is established by a conservative, John A. Macdonald, who rules for 25-ish years with a break in the middle? And that is because, as I said at the outset, the Liberals come out of the Reform movement. The Reform movement was pushing for a type of independence from Britain, a more free market economy. The Conservatives were the holdouts that wanted to be connected to the mother country. And John A. Macdonald and the people around him turn that on its head. They become he actually called himself a liberal conservative. He coined this expression for himself.
Which is still used today.
Still used today, for sure. And he did that in order to kind of take from the liberals, called the reformers at the time, take from them their main platform, which was more independence for these settlers and a free market economy. He just sort of took that and was like, yeah, that's ours now. And we're still going to have a good relationship with Britain. We're just going to do it differently and so on. And so this left the reformers / Grits / liberals at a loss as to what they were politically, what they stood for, what they meant. And it isn't until, a couple of decades into the establishment of Canada that they start to figure out what is the niche they can carve out. Can they be a rival political faction within the ruling capitalist class? And Laurier helps, because he establishes that they can have this bridge to the Québécois ruling class, and they can generate votes from Québécois voters, and therefore the Liberals can become relevant. So I mean, for me, that's if there's a significance to the Laurier era, it is that. From any other standpoint, the Laurier era is like any other. The residential school system proceeds without any interruption, as do all other elements of Canadian colonialism. Canada participates in the Boer War at the behest of Britain, lest we should think that, the Liberals had any sense of, we're fighting against the British, we're going to be independent. No, they joined the Boer War. And as you know, I think we've talked about on your show before, when Canada was in South Africa during the Boer War, it was Canadians who did things like establish concentration camps for Boer prisoners, that is South African prisoners, which very, very quickly became concentration camps for Black South Africans, to be run by deputized white South African police. Canada establishes these concentration camps, and then essentially teaches or models for the white South Africans how to run a good concentration camp in South Africa. Yeah, this is just a tidbit, right? I could go on, we could do a whole show on Canada in the Boer War, and that's all under the Liberal Prime Minister, Wilfrid Laurier, right? So everything else about Canada proceeds apace.
Unbelievable. And in fact, when South Africa was founded as the grotesque apartheid settler colonial country it is, how they found inspiration with Canada's apartheid with respect to Indigenous people. Very little modeling how Canada treated its Black people, but really how Canada treated its Indigenous people, and of course how the U.S. did with Black people with Jim Crow, and how Australia and New Zealand treated its Indigenous people. So that's fascinating. And in the future, we are going to. I am actually planning on doing a series about South Africa, so I'll get you back on for that. So after Laurier steps down, the Liberals had their interim leader, Daniel Duncan Mackenzie, but eventually the party selected, and the public at large elected, William Lyon Mackenzie King, who from August 7, 1919 till August 1948 was leader of the Liberal Party and Prime Minister of Canada during some exceptionally tumultuous times in history, World War II. So what are his positive legacies, bad ones with relation to the capitalism, and others that you think shouldn't be overlooked? And I have to add, I believe he even remains one of Canada's longest-serving prime ministers. Take it away.
Yeah, I mean, if you're looking for the good, you brought the wrong guest. I don't have much good to say about any member of the Canadian ruling class from any era. Um, so
Oh,
y-
okay. So before you talk about the bad, let me inject the good. Come on, I mean, like, of course, there was mass working class resistance, there was mass demonstrations, the Winnipeg General Strike, and so forth. But he did make a lot of concessions to the working class and help develop the modern day Canadian what we want to call the middle class or the bourgeoisie, as our Marxist friends would call them. I mean, yeah, a lot of the kind of policies Franklin Delano Roosevelt did in the U.S. Basically, William Mackenzie King did that in Canada, and what Labour governments had done in New Zealand and Australia, giving massive concessions to the mostly white working class. William Mackenzie King did that. You would agree with that, correct?
I would, yeah. It's just that I wouldn't give him any credit for it. I would say, you're right to point out that it was happening in other places, and so I would historicize all that by saying this is a period in the settler colonies and in the world generally, but in particular in the settler colonies. This is a period of massive working class militancy, especially after the First World War. The anger that survivors of the First World War brought back. Every November when we go through these ludicrous ceremonies, we're given this perception of the veterans of the First World War as though they fought some noble struggle and came back, proud and grateful for the opportunity, whatever else is sort of the way it's framed. But they actually came back angry as fuck. And many veterans of the war become labor activists in the coming years. The Winnipeg General Strike featured men who had returned from the war. Even at the end of the war itself, there's soldiers who are mutinying against their own generals. So this is a period, the 1920s and into the 1930s, just of massive labor militancy. It's the moment where political parties of the left start to become significant. There was the emergence in Canada of the Communist Party of Canada, later the emergence of the CCF, which I would argue was created to blunt the edge of the Communist Party of Canada, to be a kind of quasi-left-wing party that would siphon some people off from the Communist Party and bring them over to a less militant position. But nevertheless, it still exists and puts pressure on the ruling class in that era. As a matter of fact, many of the concessions that William Lyon Mackenzie King eventually makes as the Liberal Prime Minister, he makes due to pressure from J.S. Woodworth of the CCF, upon whom he relied because he had a minority government. And so King's government relied on the fact that the CCF, which becomes the NDP later, the CCF had to vote with the Liberals in any kind of vote of non-confidence, otherwise the Liberal government would fall. And so they could always threaten to bring down the Liberal government unless they got certain things to go their way. By the way, Jagmeet Singh had this same setup with Justin Trudeau over the last
That's
six.
yeah, no. It's
Yeah.
I
And
believe,
didn't use it, by the way.
yeah.
Didn't do anything with it. So credit the CCF. At the very least, they used that position to push through some important social welfare policies, whether that be related to healthcare, whether that be related to welfare itself, unemployment insurance, these sorts of things. So yeah, those things happened during the era of William Lyon Mackenzie King, but not because he believed in them. He disdained the poor and racialized people, not because the Liberal Party had any particular commitment to the working class or ever had. They are a party of the ruling class. They always were. They remain so. not because they had any affinity towards the people who were actually forcing their hand on these issues, the working class people that were forcing their hand on these issues. I mean, look, we can get very specific about this. In the 1930s, in 1937, William Lyon Mackenzie King goes to Berlin in Germany and meets with Adolf Hitler and several other leading members of the Nazi Party. Among the things that they discuss are the civil war in Spain and the fact that working class people from Canada had gone to fight in Spain against fascism, which Hitler didn't like. And King, who adored, and I mean adored, Adolf Hitler, idolized Adolf Hitler in a way that borders on creepy, but people often emphasize the creepy part of it when in fact the political substance of it is what matters. And King's political values aligned very closely with Hitler's. He comes back to Canada and immediately makes it illegal for Canadians, working class people in Canada, to go to Spain and fight against fascism, in Spain. So any notion that the Liberal Party or William Lyon Mackenzie King had some kind of affinity for the working class, I mean, you read the way they talked about the working class in Parliament, and you would
read the way they talked about, read the way William Mackenzie King talked, and he even thought about Jewish people. I mean,
exactly. Many of whom were in the working class in Canada. We forget that Jewish people were among the leaders of working class movements in Canada at that time. When here in Toronto, where I am right now, when fascists came out in the early 1930s and were starting to make their presence felt, it was often working class Jews and Italians who literally took the streets and fought against these fascists. So, yeah, William Lyon Mackenzie King sided with fascism against Jewish people, against poor people, against racialized people. It just so happened. And again, maybe this takes us back to some of what I said about Wilfrid Laurier, about how do they remain the natural governing party in Canada? Well, by being a little bit adaptable, by being a little bit flexible, by having enough room to kind of flex their politics just enough. Okay, we're going to give the working class just enough that we can temper this moment. There is a moment of real militancy, and it doesn't turn into a rebellion or a revolution in Canada. And that's partly because the King government understood we have to give these people something. We have to give them a little bit, right? And I think that is what the Liberal Party has excelled at, and that is the reason they have consistently been the governing party, where the Conservatives haven't always been able to have that flexibility and give those crumbs to the working class.
and that's fascinating. And so, and then we get to the 1950s. So throughout much of the 50s, the Liberal Party leader and elected prime minister was Louis Saint-Laurent, the 12th prime minister of Canada. Anything you can tell us about him, or not much? Continued on more or less with with the achievements of William Mackenzie King.
Yeah, I mean, Louis Saint-Laurent was doing mostly the same things, the same bad things, I think what is significant again is another French liberal prime minister. So again,
Yep.
the Liberal Party finding a way to forestall tensions between the quote unquote two races of Canada. That's probably, the most significant thing about Louis Saint-Laurent as far as that era goes. I mean, everything else is the same. My favorite story about Saint-Laurent is in 1956, when Vietnamese people, now bear in mind, Vietnamese people had been colonized by a number of different powers, France in the first place, and then Japan during the Second World War, and then after they fought for their freedom against Japan in 1945, France, who had just earned its liberation from the Nazis themselves, go back to Vietnam and say, okay, you're ours again. Vietnamese people say, no, fuck that, rebel against the French, and by 1956 they win, despite support from Canada, Britain, and the United States. They defeat the French at Dien Bien Phu in 1956. It is probably one of the most significant military successes of colonized people of the 1950s and 60s. It is an absolutely transformative moment for the anti-colonial struggles of that era. Louis Saint Laurent goes to the Canadian Parliament and says, "We lament the tragic outcome at Dien Bien Phu, and we salute the heroes who defended the fortress." He is talking about the French. He's saluting the French, not the Vietnamese. And then, by the way, Canada sits on how can I describe it? A UN panel that is meant to oversee the terms of the peace agreement between France and the newly liberated Vietnamese people and the Americans. I don't know why they were involved, but we know how that goes. And so Canada sits on the ICC to oversee this and make sure that the Americans get what they want in the settlement, the post-war settlement of Vietnam, which of course, as you know, ends up being a divide between a North and a South Vietnam, the Vietnamese War, and everything that flows from that.
Okay, I wasn't planning on asking this question. I have to ask this question, but so respond to it briefly because we're almost out of time. Is this: you say that the Liberal Party, unlike the Conservative Party back then, the Progressive Conservative Party of back then, was always able to get Anglophone plutocrats working with Quebec Francophone elites, build that bridge together, get some of the upper middle class, the bourgeoisie together. So, is the Liberal Party always able to appeal to those who believe in the British Empire and those Quebecers who would like nothing to do with Canada because Canada is part of the Crown, but lionize their brothers and sisters and cousins back in France and the Francophone Empire? I'm curious your response on that.
I think that what the Liberal Party has been able to cultivate, and it's a gradual process, but what the Liberal Party cultivated was a perception that they were for an independent Canada, a distinct Canada, a Canada distinct from the British Crown, distinct from France, and uniquely multicultural. I mean, that term doesn't come into popular usage until the 90s, but before that, there's different terms that are used, and certainly terms that expressed, the uniting of French and English. And the Liberal Party has always been the party that framed itself in that way. And I think skillfully, in a way that, the Liberals still appeal to people who like Britain. I mean, they were always still able, they weren't firebrand about their hatred of the British Crown. I mean, this is still Canada. There is still the legacy of the Loyalists and so on. But by comparison to the Conservatives, they didn't hold on to that sort of cultural attachment to Britain in the same way that the Conservative Party often did. We've taken the narrative into like the 50s and 60s, and by this point, the two parties have kind of emerged with their differences, and by that point, and certainly into the modern era, most of the differences between the Liberals and Conservatives are about presentation, not policy. I would argue that from a policy perspective, the party in power is almost irrelevant. Almost irrelevant. There are moments, of course, where one party or another, there's little quirks and things, but at a substantive level, almost irrelevant. Both liberal and conservative governments built up the welfare state at the moment when it needed to be built up. During the King era, but then into the 50s and 60s, both liberals and conservatives built up the welfare state because that's what capital needed at that moment. Capital needed to buy back its working classes. It needed to put money in their pockets so they could buy cars and buy houses. Like, that was where capitalism was. By the 1980s, this shifts. In the 1980s, with the shift to neoliberalism, it's all about taking that shit back, scrapping those policies, getting rid of taxes on big corporations. And guess what? Both parties did it.
Yeah, well, it's fascinating. You almost have to go. So I have to. So unfortunately, I have to ask you this. So I have to ask you this last question, and of course, this episode will be to be continued. Then, so then talk to us about after the prime minister after Louis Saint Laurent. Canada was under the democratic control of the Progressive Conservatives, which would be Canada's rival oligarch, settler colonial rival imperialist party. John Diefenbaker was the prime minister for a period of time, but he would be eventually unseated by Lester B. Pearson, who would become the 14th prime minister and leader of the Liberal Party. He governed much of the 1960s. Now, I know about his foreign policy, I know about his settler colonialism, and I know Pearson was a monster who doesn't deserve the Nobel Peace Prize. But what about his socio-economic policies in Canada? How should we look on his legacy, his time in office? Do enlighten us about Pearson.
Um, you know, Yuri, I think I'm a broken
Single payer
record, but I think
healthcare. You
I,
guys got you guys got single payer healthcare under Pearson.
yes, yes. But again, I mean, that's just the moment in capitalism. He is reflecting what the ruling class in capitalism is doing in that moment. And it's not just in Canada. It's now, granted, it didn't go as far in the US. They didn't get universal healthcare in the US, but in many other countries, in many other settler colonies and European countries, there is this moment where the colonial powers are trying to shore things up in the homeland, as it were. Keep in mind, this is the early Cold War. The Soviet Union is massively outperforming expectations and economic expectations, that is, providing a material life for its citizens that is pretty good, without any of the insecurities of capitalism. And there is a very real sense amongst the Western powers that they need to give their working class people a reason to believe in capitalism. Right? They have to buy them back. By the 1960s, you have some very serious radical movements emerging, most of them related to anti-colonial struggles elsewhere, but then reverberating back into the metropoles, right? Certainly in the US, you've got the Black Power movement emerging in a very serious way. In Canada, you have the Red Power movement. You have Indigenous struggles that are emerging in a very serious way. And, I think
Very quickly, did the Red Power movement come even before the American Indian movement in the United States?
They're very related. In
Okay,
fact, I would say red power is kind of almost like a blanket. I'm using it anyways as like a blanket term
okay,
for
fair enough.
those very militant indigenous struggles that emerge in both Canada and the U.S. around the same time and linked to one another, and linked to the Black Power struggles and linked to the anti-Vietnam protests and linked to civil rights struggles for other communities, linked to anti-colonial struggles. Like all of this stuff is happening, right? And the ruling classes are nervous. They are very nervous about what this means. They're losing the colonies. They're afraid they're going to lose their working classes too. And so, yeah, this is the era in which social welfare becomes a very real thing. It gets put on the table, and it may be groups like the CCF that are vocalizing those specific demands, but really the CCF is pretty powerless, absent a militant working class underneath it that is, going on strikes, taking on serious protests, doing direct action, and so on, which is what was happening in the 50s and 60s. So I don't have any credit to give Lester Pearson. The racist,
Okay.
colonial, upper class, I'm just trying to choose words that aren't swears.
And like William Mackenzie King before him, these concessions did that come because of the fact that he had a minority government or something like that, or
I don't think in Pearson's case, I don't think so. I could be misremembering. I think
okay,
that Pearson generally had a majority, but was in a position of trying to shore up support from the working classes. A process that's happening at a very similar way in the United States. Again, okay, not the healthcare piece. Like that's where, yes, there
Exactly.
are sometimes these little specific quirks, and sometimes they're important. They have important consequences, but from a broader kind of like, well, why is all of this happening? Why does it take shape in certain ways? It's taking shape because that's where capitalism was, and liberalism is the ideology of capitalism, and the Liberal Party is the purest expression of that ideology. The Conservative Party emerges as like almost I would say an impure expression of the same ideology. The Conservative Party is
Hence why they call themselves the Progressive Conservatives, and I would say, well, you can correct me if I'm wrong. I would say influenced by the fact that Teddy Roosevelt, I mean, he was a conservative, but he led America in what was called the progressive era. So when we talk about the Food and Drug Administration, when we talk about ending child labor, when we talk about major concessions given to the working class as a response to anger of the Gilded Age, Teddy Roosevelt was what we called a progressive conservative or a moderate Republican of that back then, and that's how I kind of view the progressive conservatives of a John Diefenbaker, a John Clark, and so forth. They
mhm,
were one
mhm.
nation Tories, whereas the Liberal Party, like the Democrats, believe in noblesse oblige. Correct?
Yeah, yeah, I think that's true, and I think as time passes and as these parties kind of develop, there is always this kind of factional rivalry between them, and at times like they will shade one way or another simply because that's where there is political space, and I mean. In this moment, I'm using it more as electoral space. Like, okay, the conservatives have left this issue alone. We will make that issue ours, and that's how we will get votes. So political in a very superficial or shallow way. But in a deeper way, if we're talking about the deeper politics, I would say, these are just two factions of the same. They have the same politics with slightly different expressions in different moments. In our moment now, in the 2020s, conservatism is an ideology of capitalism that leans into a reactionary expression, right? Liberalism in this era has leaned into a kind of inclusivity in terms of the language and the presentation of what it's doing. I make up an example, but it's kind of like we the liberals believe that all people, whether they're gay, lesbian, straight, transgender, bisexual, whatever, should be forced to work for minimum wage. We're not gonna discriminate who gets exploited. We're gonna make sure everyone gets exploited equally. So it's this disguising of the fundamental capitalist politics at the heart of it. Whereas the conservatives in this moment will come out with a homophobic screed, will say the most homophobic shit you've ever heard in your life. But still, fundamentally, it's like, yeah, we still like get to work, get to work. We need to exploit you.
Unfortunately, Tyler, you have to go. Correct?
I do, yeah. I mean, I can give you
Okay.
about another 5-10 minutes, but
Then last question, and then we'll do another recording next week to talk about the rest of the prime ministers. So Pearson was later succeeded by certainly one of the most polarizing figures in Canadian history, especially if we talk about the Liberal Party, Pierre Elliott Trudeau. I'm looking forward to how you place him in history. Do tell us his socio-economic legacy with the working class poor, the middle class, precarious middle class, and how do you critically assess the man who was elected in 1968. And he was prime minister throughout much of the 70s, was briefly leader of the opposition, if I remember, and Joe Clark of the progressive conservatives was prime minister. But very briefly, Trudeau had made a comeback and then stepped down as prime minister in June 1984. So, yes, do talk to us about his time in office. How do you assess Pierre Trudeau, who
yeah, I mean,
talked of wanting a just Canada.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I think in many ways everything I've just been talking about, like Pierre Trudeau is a crucial moment in a kind of transition from, that earlier phase to the current phase of liberalism. Pierre Trudeau is the one who ushers in the idea that we will speak nicely. William Lyon Mackenzie King didn't speak carefully. I mean, he did act as a sort of bridge between, on questions of relationships to Britain and so on. But I mean, he also openly said that he was glad that the atomic bomb had been dropped on the Japanese rather than being dropped on the white races of Europe. That's a direct quote. So, at that point, the Liberal Party and its denizens weren't being particularly careful. And even Pearson, in a certain way, Pearson is the first moment where I think the Liberals start to become very conscious of trying to carefully construct their image. For example, when Pearson's friend, actually old friend from their university days, his name escapes me right this moment because I'm got a bit of brain fog today, but a well-known Canadian activist whose name I'll think of eventually had gone to Korea during the Korean War and was reporting on what had happened in Korea and what was happening, and
Bethany,
specifically
I
talked
think
about
Bethany, John Bethany, or something like that.
not Bethany. I mean, I could find it. It would waste a little bit of time, but I'll find it for you later, and you can
Okay, perfect.
splice it in. But he was an activist in Canada, and he talked about the fact that biological and chemical weapons were being used against people in North Korea during the Korean War. And Lester Pearson, was very, very concerned about this because it was true, but he didn't want the Canadian media reporting it. And so, Pearson kind of acknowledges that, yeah, this is true, but we need to clamp down, we need to censor the press, we can't let this get out. So for me, there's a turning point moment there. Pearson is, and this is before Pearson was prime minister. He was in the cabinet, but he was not prime minister yet. So
Yeah, no, he was a major foreign minister before he became prime
exactly,
minister.
exactly. So it was already happening there, but with the rise of Pierre Trudeau, Canadian liberalism really kind of leans into the idea of creating a perception of inclusivity, modernity, progressiveness. This government represents all of the things you people have been asking for, all of the panache, the youth, the style, the okay, yes, we can be more open about sexuality things. Yes, we can be more open about race, and we can, these things can change. We can be better. And the Pierre Trudeau government is the first of the Liberal governments to embrace that performance, right? And to really actively try to perform that in a way that previous governments hadn't tried to do. The Diefenbaker government didn't try to perform progressiveness at all. Didn't care. That wasn't what it was. It wasn't trying to speak to people in that way. But of course, Pierre Trudeau does, and and it leads to some really complicated, confusing policies. Even we think about, let's say, in the 1970s in Latin America, Canada's foreign policy positions would seem contradictory. On the one hand, there's a coup that overthrows and murders, a democratic left-wing president in Chile, and Canada celebrates it and immediately starts funding that government. But then a few months later, Canada says, "Whoa, but this is pretty scary. If people want to come to Canada, we'd be happy to accept, immigrants, or refugees from Chile." And Canada accepts refugees. It's this bizarre, contradictory thing, and it's in part because there was a huge amount of pressure on the Canadian government to do this from civil society, but also because Pierre Trudeau, unlike previous Liberal governments, was concerned about creating a perception that he was a nice guy and that the Liberals were nice and kind and would be this force for good in the world. Again, think about the era. This is the 1970s, the post-Vietnam, or Vietnam and into the post-Vietnam era. Imperialism has a bad rep. You can't openly walk around being an imperialist anymore because it looks bad.
Did
So
he
Pierre
pretend to be
Trudeau is
against the
trying
Vietnam War?
to. Sorry, say that again?
Did Trudeau pretend to be against the Vietnam War? Because Pearson actually, contrary to what Lyndon McQuaig and others say, Pearson was supportive of the Vietnam War.
Oh yeah, oh yeah. So was Trudeau.
Okay,
Um,
okay.
I mean, from time to time they would give lip service to being against it, but in a material way, Canada was providing. I mean, listen, after the war was over, when people went around some of these Vietnamese cities to clean up after the places that were occupied by the West, they were ripping Canadian maple leaf flags off of brothels in Vietnamese cities. And that's an anecdote, but materially, Canada was very, very involved in the Vietnam War from start to finish. So yeah, I mean, at every
But
meeting,
but you were saying but you were saying that Trudeau that Trudeau, for example, paid lip service. So he so here's an example of him paying lip service. Correct me if I'm wrong. He would talk about Canada needs to be an open Canada. We need to welcome immigrants from around the world and build this multicultural Canada. We need to be a bilingual Canada, so we need to officially all be speaking French and English and so forth like that. But of course, many of the black people who came here were treated like dirt. Many of those Vietnam veterans that were deserting the U.S. Army and so forth would flee to Canada, but Canada was was sending weapons over to the U.S. was allowing U.S. Was Canadian soldiers to go fight in the U.S. Army, even though they were officially, like Iraq, not supposed to be at war. Is that typical? Is that typical Pierre Trudeau?
yes, everything you're saying is true and typical. Exactly.
And of
It
course,
is.
if Canada has done any good, accepting Chilean refugees, accepting people from around the world to come immigrate to Canada, it's only because of people power, not out of the goodness of the Liberal Party's hearts.
Exactly, exactly. It is only ever because it has become politically expedient for them to do that. Because the Liberal Party has calculated that if we do this, it will help our political machine keep running. And so, yeah, usually that's because there has been popular movements, social movements forcing their hand, making it easier for them to simply go along with it. And that is the Trudeau era in many ways. I mean, another example of these contradictions are his trip to Cuba, where, this highly publicized, oh, he's not going to just follow Uncle Sam. He's going to, do his own thing. Canada's going to chart its own independent policy, which is, of course, another legacy of Pierre Trudeau, which is, the repatriation of a Canadian constitution, a Canadian flag, kind of a reinscribing of Canadian independence from Britain, but also at the same time independence from the US, this performance of, well, just because the Americans don't like Cuba, that doesn't mean we can't be friends. All the while Canada's spying on Cuba on behalf of the Americans. A few years after their celebrated little visit in Havana, there's a revolutionary movement to liberate countries in southern Africa, Angola and Mozambique. Cuba sends soldiers to support this struggle against apartheid South Africa, and Canada reacts with horror. That is the quote. Canada reacts with horror at the presence of Cuban soldiers in Angola. So it's always performance. It's always a performance. The Liberal Party is always performing something. But that is in contrast to the Conservative government, which is performing something different. Because over time, conservative governments, or the Conservative Party, established a different base of support, a more conservative in the sense of people who are still willing to openly be racist, still willing to openly be sexist, still want to celebrate the old institutions of authority, the state, the police, the troops, the flag, the nation, the church.
So the leader of the opposition of the PC throughout the times that Trudeau was prime minister, and this includes John Clark, are still actually very much so, contrary to how they depict themselves in prime minister debates, which, as I agree with you, there's not that much difference between the Liberal Party and the Progressive Conservative Party. Many people would say there's not much difference between the Liberal Party of today and the Conservative Party of today. So, but So that being said, the PC still is very like just like old-fashioned conservatives, and which like in which they're not as open to immigrants compared to maybe liberals who might be open to a Lebanese immigrant coming over here, a Greek immigrant coming over here, the odd French or Belgian, and those niggers from the Caribbean and elsewhere, right?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think that is the distinction, you know, and I think that over time these things move and they shift, but I think at a material policy level, these parties are virtually indistinguishable. And if you plugged different parties in at different times, like policy changes, but my argument would be it changes based on the context of that moment, not the party that is in power. So yeah, the 19 from you know roughly from the 1940s to the 1970s, you have the era of the welfare state, and regardless of which party is in power in a given moment, they all more or less support the construction of the welfare state and its use during that time, and a certain amount of immigration for a range of different reasons, sometimes deeply selfish isn't the right word, strategic, encouraging immigration from Eastern Europe, to try to bring reactionaries from places like Ukraine or Poland and bring them into Canada and establish a more right-wing diaspora community here. That was a conscious policy that crossed the two political parties and existed in both parties. And then in the 1980s, there's that shift towards neoliberalism, which both parties embraced.
But off the top of your head, what made people keep voting for Trudeau? Like, what made largely working class people uh vote for a Trudeau? And yeah, what made our largely white the largely white middle class vote for Trudeau? Because he was prime minister for quite a long time. I think he might even give William Mackenzie King almost a run for his money in terms of how many times he was elected prime minister. So what was it?
I mean, in many ways, it's like just the quirks of electoral politics, right? I mean, it is a successful performance of those things. And I think I said at the top, if we ask ourselves why has the Liberal Party been the ruling party in Canada's history for the most part, and I said it's because they've been flexible enough to kind of be everything and nothing at the same time. And I mean, I would say that's part of the success of both Trudeau governments was the ability to kind of say one thing and do another, but do it in a way that was relatively smooth. That was relatively liberals always are able to kind of skate through and around their hypocrisies, and give a little bit here and there, sure, Justin Trudeau legalized marijuana, which satisfied a certain group of people. Didn't do electoral reform, which pissed off a bunch of others. Like, I mean, they find ways to thread the needle, and I think they're able to do it better, generally better than conservative governments, because conservative governments are more beholden to a specifically and deeply reactionary section of the ruling class.
And
The
so
most reactionary sections, the most racist, the most sexist, the ones that hate immigrants the most, the ones that hate gay people the most, the ones that hate poor people the most, that section that hate Indigenous people the most, that section of the conservative base, it does hold them back at times. Maybe right now we're entering a period where it's going to work to their favor, but
and Trudeau, like William Mackenzie King before him, like Lester Pearson, like his son right now, led a minority government, and also led a supply confidence government the CCF had become the NDP, and it was the Lewis Lewis the leader of the NDP. What was his name at the time?
I'm not sure. I don't know who you're referring to.
Okay,
Um,
well, the leader of the NDP at the time was I'm blanking on his first name, but his last name is Lewis. We all
Okay.
know who. We all know the famous Lewis family.
Okay. Okay. Oh, Avi Lewis's dad. Yeah. Right. I want to say Steven, but I think that's a different guy. But I know who you mean.
Exactly, exactly. So, David Lewis, David
There
Lewis,
we go.
David Lewis. Yeah, so David Lewis of the NDP was in a supply confidence agreement with Pierre Trudeau. So is that why Pierre Trudeau is able to govern, and whatever good stuff he did, whatever concessions were given to the working class, and whatever social liberal stuff was achieved, is that because they were in a minority government and supply confidence government, or
I mean, I wouldn't say it's all because of that. I would say that's a piece, right? I mean,
okay,
that's another piece. In the same way that with Mackenzie King, it was like there were a few things that came together, including the fact that there was social upheaval, including the fact that there was a minority government and they relied on the NDP, including the fact that the NDP at that time was pressured to be a more left government. Keep in mind, over the last stretch of years, I don't know if 6 years or so, but there has been a stretch here where Jagmeet Singh had that same power over the Trudeau government, and did almost nothing with it. I think the one concession that comes to mind that Jagmeet Singh's NDP takes credit for is daycare funding for daycare, which, listen, independently as a single thing, it's good. I'm glad it was done. But if you have that power over government to do more, of course, the answer is because the NDP is also a capitalist political party. And unless the NDP somehow had a wellspring of pressure from below to force it to be a more left-wing party, which it does not, it's going to continue to basically function as a little side partner to the Liberals. So um, it's funny, Youri, in some ways I'm a terrible guest for this discussion because I'm so deeply cynical about, the idea that any of these parties could have meaningful differences. But at least I hope what I've done is to try to identify why they do behave differently at times. And my contention is that it has nothing to do with some kind of, oh, the liberals are just nicer, or they're just better, but that it is about how do each of them view their relationship to what does the state exist to do? The state exists to protect capitalism. That's what those political parties are trying to do, but they have slightly different relationships to how to do that, why they're doing that, who they're doing that for. And that's kind of historically created over time. So,
well, unfortunately, you have to go, but folks, do not worry. But yeah, folks, do not worry. We will return with Tyler. We will be talking about the rest of the Liberal Party leaders afterwards. So join us for yes. For join us for then, and until then, do not forget to donate generously to One Plus One, share widely, and we'll see you then.